Over the last few lessons, we've been examining a number of different key battles that took place during the First World War. We began by looking at a series of key battles that began on the Western Front, so passing through 1915, through the stalemate and the deadlock between the two warring factions, and towards the Battle of Verdun in 1916, the Battle of the Somme towards the end of 1916, as well as the Battle of Passchendaele that took place in 1917. We then moved on to look at key battles that took place in other theatres of conflict, in other theatres of war, so namely the ones that took place with regard to the Gallipoli offensive, and we did a whole lesson examining the Gallipoli offensive in more detail. Now, in this lesson, we're going to talk about some of the key events and implications that were had with the conflict that took place at sea. Now, there are a few battles that take place at sea. However, for the most part, we are talking more about other not necessarily militaristic implications. So there were things like blockades, as well as the implications for the United States entering the war that were impacted by the conflict at sea. This is going to be the final lesson which examines the stalemate during World War I. We're going to examine some of the key events that take place within the conflict at sea. Now, this is the second of the major topics, by the way, the stalemate period of World War I, and the next of the major topics is going to be looking at how the war ends. We're going to examine the impact of the blockade, as well as arguably the most important impact that took place at sea, which is, of course, the influence of the United States, who joined the war as a result of things that took place at sea. So, as I mentioned, there were no decisive battles at sea during the First World War. There was no Battle of the Somme, for example, or there was no, if we're talking about World War II comparisons, there was nothing like, for example, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, which was, of course, a sea conflict, or the Battle of the Coral Sea, for example, that took place in World War I. This is not to suggest that the tensions and the conflict at sea were not crucially important, especially with regard to the impact on the First World War. It's just that there wasn't necessarily any decisive battles that took place at sea, but there were other things that took place at sea that were incredibly impactful on the First World War. Alongside the war on land, new technologies did develop to improve the war at sea. So, for example, submarines were a relatively new development in sea warfare. And in reality, there were two major influences that were had in relation to war at sea. So, for example, the introduction of a blockade, and then secondly, the United States joining the conflict as well. So these two were not battles per se, but they were things that essentially very heavily impact the influence and the outcome, should I say, of the First World War. So let's think about the first of these, which is the naval blockade. And given the fact that both Britain and Germany relied on imports from sea, the idea of a naval blockade would be crucially significant for either side in being able to hamper the effectiveness of the opposing forces. If you were able to block off imports, for example, against Germany, then it would make it very difficult for Germany to properly and effectively maintain their war economy, which would essentially starve them out until they would have to capitulate. Which is essentially what happened. So the Royal Navy instigated a blockade to stop essential supplies of food and war materials going to Germany. By 1918, the blockade was increasingly more effective, with many Germans at home beginning to starve. So this is something that essentially is a long-term process. If you instigate a blockade, it's not going to have an impact, a measurable impact straight away. Rather, it is going to very slowly deplete the resources of the state that you are actually at war with to such an extent that over a very long period of time, they will eventually need to capitulate. Eventually, if a blockade continues, they will have to capitulate eventually, because there are essential materials that are always needed to be imported, and if they come from sea, then they have to either find other ways around it, or other ways of getting it. They have to either do that, break the blockade, or surrender, essentially. Now, the fact that by 1918 the blockade was becoming more and more and more effective, this had an increased impact on the morale of those at home. If you're beginning to starve at home in Germany, then as a result of that, you're going to have a very detrimental outlook on the war. You're going to want the war to end just to be able to have the blockade be relieved. And essentially, when we think about the German surrender that takes place in November of 1918, the blockade was one of the reasons for the German surrender. It was one of the reasons why Germany sought that they were not going to win this conflict. And this was one among many other reasons as well. The other reason that is also very pertinent is this idea and the influence, should I say, of the United States in entering the conflict. In response to a blockade campaign, which was increasingly seeing the Germans becoming more and more desperate, the German Navy utilized U-boats in order to sink British ships to try and counteract some of the damaging effects that the blockade was having on Germany by trying to have a damaging effect on the United Kingdom, on Britain. This was relatively successful, but at one point we see tensions begin to rise between Germany and the United States, because in 1915 a German U-boat sunk not a supply ship but a British liner by the name of the Lusitania. Now, the Lusitania was sunk, which led to the deaths of 1,198 passengers. 128 of those passengers were US citizens, which of course had a dramatic impact on the United States and called for some kind of response or some kind of action on the part of the United States. It was incredibly problematic, since it could have led essentially to the United States automatically entering the war, because the attack on the Lusitania could have been perceived as an attack on the United States, given that there were so many US citizens aboard. Now, essentially in response to this, the Kaiser, very, very reticent to the fact that the United States entering the war would be incredibly problematic, essentially ordered all German army to stop attacking American ships. They made it very, very clear that they would have to maintain a barrier between the ships that could be attacked, that were definitely British ships and did not have any US citizens on them, and United States ships, which were obviously would have eventually caused the US to enter the war in the first place. And so this was an order that the Kaiser had put in place from the beginning of essentially from when 1915 began, or at least when the Lusitania had been sunk. And it continued from 1915 into 1917. But due to the desperation that was had on the blockade, as a result of the blockade, they had to start attacking American ships again to try and alleviate and try and respond to the blockade that was being put up on them. The result of which would be that in 1917, specifically in April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States managed to get a declaration of war from Congress against Germany and officially declared war on Germany, which really did signal the end of the conflict for Germany, considering the fact that, given how depleted they were already, they gained a relative boost when Russia surrendered in 1917, and they have the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and we have the collapse of the Russian Empire and the Russian Revolution in 1917. But ultimately, the entering of the USA into the war meant that it was essentially the beginning of the end for the United States, for Germany. So while I said that there were no key decisive battles, arguably the most prevalent battle that took place at sea during the First World War was the Battle of Jutland. And on the 31st of May 1916, this was the only major battle at sea that began. It was the Battle of Jutland, and Admiral Scheer of the German fleet had made an attack in the North Sea against the British. Again, these were all in response to the blockade that had been put on the German imports. Admiral Beatty was the commander of the British Grand Fleet and was put under pressure by the initial attack. So the initial attack was actually more of a surprise attack that was placed, that put pressure essentially on the British naval forces. However, they were supported by another part of the fleet who arrived at the battle just in time. And so ultimately, it was the British that would win the Battle of Jutland. and the cost of the battle were relatively significant because the British lost 14 ships, the Germans lost 13 ships. The British lost around 6,000 soldiers, and the Germans lost around 2,500 soldiers. Again, something of a success for the Germans on the one hand, but on the other hand, it was a success at a great cost because they would never come out to fight at sea again. It would be something that would not happen again. So even though on the face of it, if we just look at those numbers, British losing more sailors, losing one more ship is seen as a success, but ultimately, the pressure that was put on the British fleet and the fact that they were able to get support from other parts of the naval fleet, it essentially meant that the Germans, while being relatively successful in the Battle of Jutland, could not see themselves entering into sea warfare and naval warfare like this ever again. And they would not do this. And so they had to find other ways of trying to alleviate the blockade, which is where we get all of these ideas of increasing the amount of U-boat presence in the Atlantic, which ultimately leads to the USA entering the war. So it was a real catch-22 on the part of the German forces.